The first thing I remember is the sound of his voice. Confident, sharp, rehearsed, echoing against the wooden walls of the courtroom as if he was delivering a victory speech. "I'm taking half of everything, including her grandmother's estate," my husband announced with a grin so smug it almost felt like he was enjoying the performance. He leaned back in his chair, his gold watch glinting under the fluorescent lights, as if the fortune he was demanding was already in his pocket. "My name is Rachel Dawson. I'm 42 years old, and I never thought I'd be sitting in a divorce court fighting for the very things my grandmother spent a lifetime preserving. Yet there I was, on the defendant's side, forcing myself to sit tall while the man I once trusted with my heart painted me as nothing more than a vault he deserved to raid." On his side of the room, Bradley adjusted his designer tie and whispered something to his attorney, who smirked as if the case was already won. I recognized the suit he was wearing. It was one I had bought him during our second year of marriage, when I still believed investing in his image was an investment in us. At the time, it seemed harmless. Now, it felt like evidence of my own blindness. The gallery behind us buzzed with energy. Reporters had shown up, tipped off that a wealthy Nashville businesswoman's divorce was about to reveal millions at stake. A handful of strangers leaned forward, eager to see how much the charming husband might walk away with. Even the clerks were whispering. All of them thought they were about to witness a clean split, a husband cashing in on years of marriage. They had no idea what was really inside my purse. I sat with my attorney, Patricia, a woman whose calm presence had been my anchor through months of betrayal and preparation. She kept her eyes on the judge, a stern woman in her 60s whose reputation for fairness was almost legendary. Judge Harris didn't blink at Bradley's opening demands. She simply shuffled the paperwork in front of her, her steel-gray hair catching the light as she asked, "Mrs. Dawson, do you have any response to these claims?" My throat went dry, but my resolve was stronger than my nerves. I reached for my bag, fingers brushing against the manila envelope I'd carried with me all morning. My pulse quickened. Inside was the single document that would unravel every word Bradley had just spoken. I looked across the courtroom at him, this man who once brought me coffee in bed, who used to whisper that he loved me for my mind, my laugh, my stubbornness. For years, I believed him. I believed that when he said we, he meant us, not my bank account. Now he sat smirking at me, as if I were nothing more than a fool who'd made the mistake of loving him. The courtroom itself felt suffocating, the heavy wooden paneling and smell of old paper adding to the weight pressing on my chest. Through the tall windows I could hear faint traffic noises from the city outside, people living ordinary lives, while mine was dissected like a headline. I wondered briefly how many would read about this case in tomorrow's paper, how many would judge me without ever knowing the truth. I tightened my grip on the envelope. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Months of sleepless nights, of uncovering Bradley's lies, of reliving every moment I ignored my grandmother's warnings, had all led here. I stood, every eye turning toward me. My voice shook at first, but I forced it steady. "Your Honor," I said, holding the envelope so the light caught the seal. "There is something the court needs to see." For the first time all morning, Bradley's grin faltered. Before that courtroom showdown, before the lawyers and reporters and whispered gossip, there had been a different story. A softer one, wrapped in candlelight and promises. Bradley entered my life at a time when I was too tired to notice the shadows behind his smile. I had just turned 40, a milestone that hit harder than I expected. My consulting firm was steady, but running a company alone had left little room for romance. Friends teased me about being married to spreadsheets. My grandmother, the woman who raised me after my parents passed, had been gone for almost 3 years, and the grief still lived quietly in my chest like a stubborn echo. That's when Bradley appeared. We met at a business conference in Chicago, one of those crowded networking events with too many name tags and forced smiles. He wasn't just handsome, he was attentive. When I mentioned my work, he didn't glaze over like so many others. He leaned in, asked questions, told me how brilliant I sounded. "You see the world in numbers," he said once, "and I see the world in people. Together, we'd be unstoppable." At the time, I thought it was romantic. I didn't see it for what it really was: strategy. He had a talent for reading vulnerability like a script. If I mentioned missing my grandmother, he spoke about his close relationship with his late grandfather. When I complained about sleepless nights, he sent me playlists of calming music and texted every morning to ask how I'd slept. He seemed to fill the empty spaces in my life with ease. Our courtship unfolded like a movie montage: dinners at rooftop restaurants, weekend getaways to quiet cabins where he said he wanted to escape with me from the world. He always had money for grand gestures: a surprise necklace, tickets to the symphony, a weekend in Miami. At the time, I assumed he was just good with finances. Only later did I realize he was already treating my future inheritance like a down payment on his lifestyle. After 8 months of whirlwind romance, he proposed on a river cruise at sunset. A string quartet played as he dropped to one knee, holding out a ring so dazzling it caught gasps from the other passengers. My heart raced, not just from the moment, but from the thought that maybe, finally, love had found me when I had stopped looking. But a quiet unease lingered. My grandmother had warned me once: men who move too fast are chasing more than love. Her words tugged at me as I stared at the glittering ring, but Bradley's insistence drowned out the doubts. "Life is short, Rachel," he whispered, his eyes locked on mine. "When you know, you know." I wanted to believe him. I wanted the kind of love story other women told with pride. And so I said yes. Our wedding was elegant, not extravagant, just the way I wanted. Or at least that's what I told myself. Looking back, every detail leaned more toward Bradley's taste than mine. The guest list, the venue, even the vows he insisted we write ourselves. "Marriage," he declared in front of our friends and family, "is about sharing everything." At the time, it sounded noble. Later, I would understand it was foreshadowing. Those first months of marriage, I convinced myself I was happy. He brought me coffee in bed, kissed me on the forehead before work, and bragged to friends about how lucky he was to have me. But behind those gestures, small cracks appeared. He dismissed my long hours at the office as obsession. He insisted on handling certain bills, though he never earned enough to justify it. He was generous to strangers, leaving oversized tips at restaurants, but strangely critical when I bought anything for myself. Still, I silenced the doubts. I told myself that marriage was about compromise, that love meant overlooking flaws. I wanted so badly for the picture to be real. What I didn't know was that Bradley wasn't painting a picture of us. He was sketching a blueprint of how to claim what wasn't his. Whenever I think about the choice that saved me, my mind drifts back to my grandmother's kitchen. The old oak table, worn smooth by decades of family meals, was where she gave me lessons that felt more like gentle stories at the time. She believed wealth was more than numbers on paper. It was trust, reputation, and the legacy of those who came before you. "Rachel," she would say, tapping her spoon against her teacup, "money is a tool, not a tether. But if you don't protect it, people will use it to chain you." She had grown up during the Great Depression, when neighbors borrowed sugar and repaid it with loyalty. To her, money wasn't about showing off. It was about ensuring family had a roof, children had a future, and no one could take what rightfully belonged to you. She often told me the story of her cousin who lost the family farm to a fast-talking man who promised partnership but left with everything. "A man who wants what you own more than who you are," she warned, "is a danger in disguise." At 25, I used to roll my eyes, thinking her advice was old-fashioned. By 40, sitting across from Bradley's eager smile, those words came back like a whisper. Yet I pushed them aside. Love seemed more urgent than legacy. It was my grandmother's attorney, Patricia, who finally insisted on the prenuptial agreement. I remember the meeting vividly. Patricia spread the documents across the same oak table where my grandmother once lectured me, explaining the clauses with precision. The agreement didn't just protect what I already had. It safeguarded any future inheritance as well. This ensures, Patricia said firmly, that what your grandmother built stays in your family, not handed away by accident or manipulation. I hesitated. It felt cold, almost transactional, to present legal paperwork before marriage. Wouldn't Bradley see it as a sign of mistrust? My grandmother's framed photo on the wall seemed to watch me as I wrestled with the decision. When I finally brought it up to Bradley, bracing for anger or disappointment, he laughed it off. "Of course, darling," he said with a dismissive wave. "I don't care about money, I care about us." He signed without reading a word, making a joke about lawyers sucking the romance out of everything. I remember feeling relieved, thinking his nonchalance proved his sincerity. What I didn't realize was that his casual attitude came from arrogance. He believed no piece of paper could outmaneuver his charm. That document would later become my shield, the reason I could walk into that courtroom with my head held high. It wasn't just a prenup. It was my grandmother's voice from beyond the grave, protecting me the way she always promised she would. I often wonder if Bradley saw my grandmother's portrait in our home and ever understood. To him, she was just a photo of an old woman in pearls. To me, she was a sentinel, a reminder that love might be fragile but legacy, if guarded, was unbreakable. The first year of marriage was filled with small rituals that made me believe I had finally found balance. Bradley cooked dinner twice a week, always with a flourish, always reminding me how lucky I was to have a husband who didn't mind the kitchen. He introduced me proudly to his friends, telling them I was the smartest woman he knew. When I landed a big contract for my consulting firm, he sent flowers to my office with a note that read, "Our victory." I clung to those gestures. They felt like proof of partnership. But beneath the surface, little changes began to spread like cracks in glass. Bradley grew restless at his pharmaceutical sales job. At first, he complained about the hours, the pressure, the lack of appreciation. Then he suggested he didn't need the job at all. "Why keep grinding when we have enough?" he asked one night over wine, swirling his glass as if he already knew the answer. "I could focus on supporting you, be by your side." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to protest. My income was steady but not infinite. Yet another part felt flattered that he wanted to devote himself to me, to us. Within 6 months, he quit. Suddenly, my success became our lifestyle. At first it was small, a new watch, a golf club membership for networking, expensive dinners where he insisted we pick up the check. Then the spending accelerated. A luxury car. A failed investment in a restaurant he barely researched. A spontaneous trip to Cabo because he thought we needed to live a little. Whenever I raised concerns, he deflected with the same line. "We're partners, Rachel. Don't you trust me?" Trust. That word turned into a weapon. At parties he boasted about his entrepreneurship, leaving out that his ventures were bankrolled by my consulting contracts, and later, my grandmother's inheritance. He began introducing himself as an investor, always in the same polished tone, as if he'd built something himself. The men at the country club nodded respectfully, never realizing the checks he signed carried my name. Inside our home, things shifted too. Bradley began managing the bills without asking, saying it was easier if he handled household details. When I bought new office equipment, he sighed that I should learn to relax and stop obsessing over work. Yet he never objected when the money went toward his hobbies or whims. The illusion of partnership was perfect in public. He brought me coffee, kissed me at galas, smiled for photos like the supportive husband. People envied me, whispered about how lucky I was to have someone so attentive. They didn't see the arguments behind closed doors. They didn't hear the way he called me stingy when I refused to fund another one of his schemes, or cold when I asked him to slow down on spending. The breaking point for me came quietly, almost invisibly. One evening, I overheard him at the country club telling a group of friends that the inheritance was family money. He said it with such confidence, as if my grandmother's careful savings had been destined for him all along. The men laughed, raising their glasses in approval. I sat frozen at the bar, watching him bask in the admiration. That was the night I realized Bradley hadn't joined my life as a partner. He had moved into it like a tenant determined to take ownership, confident I wouldn't notice until it was too late. The night at the country club was only the beginning. Once Bradley tasted the admiration of others, he couldn't stop feeding it. Every gathering turned into a stage where he played the role of the self-made husband who had lifted me out of loneliness and given me a real life. His words were smooth, but the pride in his voice wasn't about me, it was about convincing everyone that he was the architect of my success. I tried to laugh it off at first. Maybe he was just insecure, maybe he needed the spotlight more than I did. But soon, his exaggerations turned into outright lies. He started introducing me as the woman, lucky enough to marry into his business ventures. He said it with a wink, as though it were a harmless joke. But I could feel the smirk beneath it. At home, the joke stopped being funny. Bradley became defensive whenever I questioned his spending. When I pointed out that his restaurant investment had lost us $30,000, he snapped, "You act like money is more important than us." When I asked why he told people the inheritance was ours, he sneered. "Everyone knows you married up when you got me. Before me, you were just a workaholic, with no one to share it with." That cut deep because it carried a sting of truth. I had been lonely before him. He had filled the silence in my life with attention, affection, and charm. And now he used that same truth as a blade, turning my vulnerabilities into weapons. I began noticing smaller betrayals too. Bradley had stopped wearing the wedding band I gave him, claiming it scratched his hand at the gym. He started coming home later, smelling of cologne that wasn't mine. When I asked, he brushed me off with a laugh, telling me I was becoming paranoid. The cruelest blow came at a dinner party we hosted for some of my clients. I had worked for weeks preparing the evening, hoping to strengthen business ties. Bradley, in his usual tailored suit, charmed the guests at first. But as the wine flowed, he grew reckless. At one point, while I was in the kitchen checking on dessert, I overheard him telling a guest, "Rachel's smart, sure, but without me, she'd still be stuck in spreadsheets. I taught her how to live." The words made my hands tremble as I set down the plates. It wasn't just arrogance, it was erasure. He was rewriting the story of my life in front of others, casting himself as the savior and me as the grateful beneficiary. That night, after the guests left, I confronted him. "Why would you say that? Why would you take credit for everything I've worked for?" His face hardened, the charm evaporating. "Because no one wants to hear about some cold businesswoman crunching numbers, they want a story, and I give it to them." I stood there in disbelief, staring at the man who had once promised me partnership. In that moment, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. Bradley didn't just want to share my life, he wanted to own it. The cracks in our marriage were no longer hidden. They were gaping fractures, visible to anyone who cared to look. The Bradley, who once held my hand through long nights of grief, had vanished, replaced by someone greedy, entitled, and cruel. It was then that I stopped hoping he would change. Instead, I started preparing for the day when his greed would push him too far, and I would need to defend everything my grandmother had built. By the time Bradley's lies and arrogance became impossible to ignore, I had already started making quiet plans of my own. It began with a phone call to Patricia, my grandmother's attorney, and the only person I trusted completely in those days. Patricia wasn't just a sainted pasha lawyer, she was a woman who had spent her career protecting people from the kinds of men who charmed first and demanded later. When I walked into her office that afternoon, she didn't greet me with pity. She greeted me with resolve. "Rachel," she said, sliding a legal pad across the desk, "I want you to start writing everything down. Every purchase, every conversation, every time he claims your inheritance as his own. Paper trails don't lie." At first, the act of documenting felt clinical, even cold. But as the weeks turned into months, it became strangely empowering. I filled notebooks with dates and receipts. I took photos of credit card statements and logged his investments that vanished into thin air. It wasn't just about protecting my assets anymore. It was about reclaiming control over a life he had been trying to rewrite. Patricia never sugarcoated the truth. Men like Bradley don't just stop, she warned. They push until they think you're too tired to fight back. That's when they take everything. Her words sank into me like stone. I realized I had spent too long waiting for him to notice the damage he was causing, hoping that the man who once brought me coffee in bed would return. That man was gone. In his place stood someone calculating, someone who saw my grandmother's legacy not as a blessing but as a jackpot. So Patricia and I began to prepare. She revisited the prenuptial agreement she had crafted years earlier, checking every clause, ensuring every signature and witness was airtight. "This is your shield," she reminded me, tapping the papers. "But a shield only works if you're willing to lift it when the attack comes." I practiced what I would say if we ever ended up in court, though at the time it still felt like a distant nightmare. Patricia coached me on staying calm under pressure, on letting Bradley reveal his true nature while I remained steady. She reminded me that judges notice not just facts but demeanor. "Let him unravel," she advised. "Your job is to be unshakable." Walking out of her office that day, I carried more than just legal advice. I carried a quiet kind of strength I hadn't felt in years. Bradley thought he was the only one making plans, whispering with his friends and bragging at the club. What he didn't know was that I was laying a foundation brick by brick, one that would eventually trap him in the web of his own arrogance. And though I didn't realize it then, I had already begun shifting from the woman who feared losing everything to the woman who was ready to let the truth burn through every lie he had built. 18 months into our marriage, the letter arrived. It came in a thick white envelope with my grandmother's attorney's name in the corner. Even before I opened it, my chest tightened. I had known, of course, that she left things for me, but I wasn't prepared for the reality written in careful legal language. My grandmother had left me everything: the house where she raised me, her carefully tended investments, her collection of rare books that lined shelves I used to fall asleep beneath as a child, and a trust account worth far more than I ever expected. It wasn't just money, it was her life's work, distilled into something meant to protect me long after she was gone. When I first read the numbers, my hands trembled. The inheritance changed my financial situation overnight. I could expand my firm, donate to causes my grandmother cared about, or finally take a breath without worrying about every invoice. Yet more than anything, it felt like her voice reaching across time, reminding me of the lessons she'd whispered at the kitchen table. "Protect what I've built. Guard it from those who only see dollar signs." Bradley's reaction should have told me everything. His eyes lit up the moment I told him, gleaming like a man who had just hit the jackpot. "Rachel, we're rich," he said, hugging me tightly, but the word "we" clung to me like a warning. It wasn't gratitude. It was ownership. From that day forward, his spending habits multiplied. He upgraded his car, claiming it was for networking. He insisted we take vacations because life is too short not to enjoy it. He poured money into a friend's startup without asking me, losing tens of thousands in the process. Every conversation about finances turned into a guilt trip. "We're married," he would say, "and marriage means sharing. Don't you trust me?" I did trust him, or at least I wanted to. But the way he used the inheritance gnawed at me. I had kept most of it in separate accounts, just as Patricia advised, but Bradley treated my regular income like an open tap, draining it with no thought for the future. The man who once praised my discipline now mocked me for being stingy. I began to notice something else too. He spoke differently about the inheritance when we were in public. At family gatherings, at dinners with friends, he would casually refer to it as our family money. He told people he was an investor now, someone building a portfolio. Each time he said it, I felt a piece of my grandmother's legacy slipping through my fingers, not financially, but symbolically. She had entrusted me with something sacred, and here was Bradley parading it like a party trick. The final straw came one evening when I overheard him on the phone with a colleague. He laughed, loud and careless, saying, "Don't worry, man, Rachel's inheritance keeps us set. I married well." Those words burned into me. Married well. as if I were nothing more than a stepping stone to his version of success. That night, as he slept soundly beside me, I sat awake at my desk staring at the prenuptial agreement Patricia had drawn up years ago. For the first time, I truly understood its power. My grandmother hadn't just left me her estate, she had left me armor. And soon, I would need to wear it. By the time the inheritance became our unspoken battlefield, Bradley had already started weaving his web. At first, it showed up in whispers, comments he let slip at parties, sideways glances from acquaintances who looked at me with a kind of pity I couldn't quite place. Eventually, the truth revealed itself in the form of a forwarded email from a colleague I trusted. The subject line read, "Divorce Strategy." I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was an exchange between Bradley and an attorney I had never met. The words cut through me sharper than any knife. He wasn't just planning for a separation, he was planning a heist. "Rachel's inheritance will be considered marital property if we play this right," one line read. Another, "She's been emotionally dependent on me. We can argue lifestyle contributions." My stomach turned as I realized he wasn't waiting for our marriage to fail, he was actively plotting to time its collapse for his benefit. That night, I confronted him with the email. For a moment his mask cracked, his eyes wide with panic. Then, just as quickly, the charm returned. "Rachel, you're overreacting," he said smoothly. "I was just exploring my options. Everyone does it. Exploring my options." He said it as casually as if he had been comparing hotel prices, not conspiring to strip me of everything my grandmother had entrusted to me. After that night, I stopped looking for the husband I thought I had married. Instead, I began to watch him carefully, documenting his behavior the way Patricia had taught me. I saw the way he whispered to his friends at the club, spinning a story where I was the cold wife who didn't appreciate him. He told people I was controlling, that I wouldn't let him make decisions about our money. He painted himself as the victim of a woman too obsessed with work to love properly. At social gatherings, I could feel eyes on me, judging me through the filter of his lies. Some nodded sympathetically when he exaggerated stories about our fights, while others leaned in to hear him brag about the vacation home he was planning to buy once the divorce was sorted out. The cruelty of it all wasn't just in his deceit, it was in the way he relished my humiliation. He knew I would hear about his words, that whispers had a way of traveling back. He wanted me to feel isolated, doubted, second-guessed by the very circles I once trusted. One evening, at a charity gala, he made his performance public. Standing among donors and executives, he raised a glass of champagne and announced loudly, "Rachel keeps me grounded with her spreadsheets. But let's be honest, I'm the visionary." Laughter rippled through the group, and I forced a tight smile, my cheeks burning. Inside, I wanted to scream. When we got home, I finally asked, "Why do you keep doing this? Why do you try to make me small in front of others?" He didn't hesitate. "Because people respect me more that way. They don't want to see a wife overshadowing her husband." In that moment, something in me hardened. He wasn't just careless, he was deliberate. Every insult, every lie, every smirk was calculated to wear me down until I surrendered what he wanted. But he underestimated me. What Bradley didn't know was that Patricia and I had already fortified my defenses. The prenup was airtight, my records were meticulous. His arrogance had blinded him to the truth. He was playing a game he had already lost. And soon, everyone else would see it too. The air inside the courtroom had shifted since the morning, growing heavier with every word Bradley's attorney delivered. He stood tall and confident, pacing slowly, as if he owned the space. His voice carried an authority that fed the audience's expectation of victory. "My client," he declared, gesturing to Bradley with a flourish, "devoted 5 years of his life to this marriage. He provided companionship, social standing, and emotional support, while Mrs. Dawson built her business and benefited from her inheritance. By law, he is entitled to half of all assets acquired during the marriage." Every sentence felt like a dagger twisted in my side, but I forced my face to remain calm. Patricia had warned me about this moment, the theater of it all, the way attorneys used language to turn greed into nobility. I could hear the scratch of reporters' pens behind me, eager to capture his confident sound bites. A few people in the gallery nodded along, clearly convinced Bradley was about to walk away a wealthy man. I glanced at Bradley. He sat with one arm stretched casually along the back of his chair, smirking at me as if daring me to break. His golden hair was slicked back, his suit immaculate. To anyone else, he looked like a man in control. To me, he looked like a stranger who had learned to weaponize charm until it became cruelty. Judge Harris listened without a flicker of expression. Her sharp eyes darted from the lawyer's notes to Bradley's posture to my still hands folded neatly on the table. She had presided over family court for decades, and though she didn't betray an opinion, I sensed she had seen this performance many times before. When the attorney finally sat down, Bradley leaned toward him with a triumphant grin. It was the same grin that had once made me feel safe. The same grin that now made my stomach turn. "Mrs. Dawson," the judge said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "do you have anything to present before we proceed?" This was it, the moment Patricia and I had rehearsed over and over. My heart thundered in my chest, but I kept my movements measured. Slowly, I reached into my bag and wrapped my fingers around the manila envelope. For a moment, I just held it there, feeling the weight of everything it represented. My grandmother's wisdom, Patricia's diligence, my own decision to protect myself, even when it felt unromantic. When I stood, the entire room seemed to shift with me. Chairs creaked. Reporters leaned forward. Bradley's confident smile faltered just enough to reveal the first crack in his mask. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady now. "There is one document that should be reviewed before any division of assets is considered." I walked toward the bench, each step echoing in the hushed courtroom. I placed the envelope in Judge Harris's outstretched hand. Her brow furrowed slightly as she broke the seal and pulled out the stack of papers. Behind me, Bradley leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "What is that?" he hissed toward his attorney, though his voice carried far enough for others to hear. The silence that followed was thick, expectant. Everyone in the room sensed that something had shifted, though they didn't yet know how much. I returned to my seat beside Patricia, who offered me the faintest nod of encouragement. The game Bradley thought he had already won was about to change entirely. Judge Harris adjusted her glasses and began flipping through the pages of the document. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the courtroom, though the silence around her was alive with tension. Bradley leaned forward, trying to read her face, but she gave nothing away. "This appears to be a prenuptial agreement," Judge Harris finally said, her tone steady but carrying just enough weight to stir the room. The words sent a ripple through the gallery. Gasps, hushed whispers, the scratching of pens as reporters tried to capture every detail. Bradley's attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We were not informed of any such document during discovery." Judge Harris didn't even glance at him. "Sit down, Mr. Wallace. I'll decide what's irregular." She turned another page, her sharp eyes scanning the clauses with practiced efficiency. I stole a look at Bradley. His face was a gidea. Shifting canvas, first confusion, then disbelief, then a flash of anger. His jaw tightened as he muttered something frantically to his lawyer. Patricia leaned toward me, her voice a whisper only I could hear. "Just breathe. We've been preparing for this moment for years." For the first time since the trial began, I allowed myself a small smile. The judge cleared her throat and read aloud from the agreement. Section 4, Paragraph A. All assets owned by either party prior to marriage shall remain the sole property of that party. Section 4, Paragraph B. Any inheritance received by either party during the marriage shall be considered separate property and shall not be subject to division upon divorce. Bradley's face drained of color. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "That can't be legal," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Judge Harris raised an eyebrow. "It is not only legal, Mr. Dawson. It is also properly executed. This agreement is dated 6 weeks before your marriage, witnessed by 2 notaries, and signed by both parties. Did you not review this with independent counsel? Bradley's attorney shuffled through his notes, his composure slipping. Your Honor, my client believed this was a formality, not a comprehensive agreement. A faint chuckle rippled through the spectators. Judge Harris's voice sharpened. Are you telling me your client signed a legal contract without reading it? The room froze. Bradley's lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then, under the weight of the judge's stare, he sputtered. I skimmed it. Rachel said it was just paperwork. You are a grown man, Judge Harris replied, her tone cutting through the courtroom. And this is one of the most thorough prenuptial agreements I've reviewed in 20 years on this bench. The reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the headline unfolding before them. Bradley, the confident husband demanding millions, had just admitted to signing away his rights without a second glance. Patricia leaned back in her chair, calm as ever, while Bradley's attorney looked as though he wished the ground would swallow him whole. I kept my eyes on Bradley, watching the mask crack wide open. His smirk had vanished. In its place was panic, raw and unfiltered. He whispered angrily to his lawyer, gesturing toward me as if blaming me for his own recklessness. Judge Harris closed the folder with a firm snap. This agreement will be admitted into evidence. It clearly protects Mrs. Dawson's premarital assets and inheritance. Unless opposing counsel has a compelling legal argument, which I doubt, the court will proceed accordingly. The room buzzed with shock. I could hear people murmuring behind me, the kind of whispers that carried both disbelief and satisfaction. The predator had walked into the trap he set for someone else. Bradley slammed his hand against the table. She tricked me, he shouted, his voice cracking. She made me think it didn't matter. Judge Harris's gaze turned icy. Mr. Dawson, control yourself, or I will have you removed from this courtroom. All at once, the image Bradley had built, the charming husband, the poised opportunist, collapsed in front of everyone. The press saw it, the strangers in the gallery saw it, and most importantly, he knew they saw it. For the first time in 5 years, I felt truly free. Bradley had always prided himself on appearances. He wore his charm like a tailored suit, slipping into rooms with that confident grin, shaking hands as though the world already belonged to him. But in that courtroom, the suit didn't matter anymore. The grin had melted. What was left was raw desperation, ugly and unpolished. As Judge Harris finished reading the key clauses, Bradley surged to his feet. This isn't fair, he barked, his voice echoing so loudly that even the bailiff stiffened. I gave up my career for her. I built this marriage. I sacrificed everything, and now she gets to keep it all? The gallery leaned in, captivated. Reporters scribbled like their pens couldn't keep up. Some spectators exchanged looks that said exactly what I was thinking. The mask was gone, and the real Bradley had finally shown himself. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, whispering frantically, but Bradley shook him off. He pointed at me, his face red with fury. You made me think we were a team. You let me believe this money was ours. Do you know how humiliating this is? Everyone at the club, everyone in our circle, they all know me as the investor, the provider. Now you're making me look like a fool. I wanted to laugh at the irony. He wasn't devastated about losing the money. He was devastated about losing the performance, the illusion that he was someone important. Judge Harris's voice sliced through the tension. Mr. Dawson, sit down. This is a court of law, not a stage for theatrics. But he didn't stop. She trapped me, he shouted, slamming his palm on the table. She used that prenup as a trick. I gave her the best years of my life, and this is how she repays me? The murmurs in the room swelled into open conversation. A woman in the back whispered, Sounds like he married her for the money. A man near the aisle chuckled under his breath. The reporters were no longer just scribbling, they were smiling, as if they'd stumbled into a scandal juicier than they expected. Patricia leaned toward me and whispered, Let him keep talking. He's writing the headline for them. Bradley's lawyer finally stood, desperation all over his face. Your Honor, I request a recess to— Denied, Judge Harris interrupted firmly. What I am witnessing right now is your client revealing his intentions loud and clear. This court does not reward greed disguised as sacrifice. Bradley's breathing grew ragged. His eyes darted around the room, landing on me. Rachel, you know this isn't right. I supported you emotionally. I gave you companionship. That has value. I met his gaze, my voice calm. You didn't support me, Bradley. You drained me. You drained my trust, my love, and you thought you could drain my grandmother's legacy too. But you forgot something. Love is a choice. Money is a responsibility. You treated both like a game. A hush fell over the courtroom. For once, Bradley had no immediate retort. He sank back into his chair, shaking his head, mumbling under his breath about betrayal and injustice. But it was too late. The spectators had seen the truth. The reporters had their story. The man who once charmed rooms with his smile had just destroyed himself in front of an audience larger than he ever imagined. And as I sat there, steady and unshaken, I realized the most poetic part of it all. Bradley wasn't being ruined by me or by the prenup. He was being ruined by his own greed, exposed in the one place he couldn't spin the narrative under oath, before a judge and in front of the world. When Bradley finally slumped back into his chair, red-faced and muttering, Judge Harris removed her glasses with a deliberate motion. The silence in the courtroom was thick, every spectator waiting for her to speak. She set the papers neatly in front of her, folded her hands, and looked directly at Bradley with a stare that could have frozen fire. "Mr. Dawson," she began, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "This court has reviewed the prenuptial agreement, the financial records, and the testimony provided. What I see is not a woman attempting to deny her spouse a fair share. What I see is a man who attempted to manipulate the law, his wife, and this court for personal gain." Bradley opened his mouth to protest, but one look from the judge shut him down. "This agreement is valid, comprehensive, and binding," she continued. "Mrs. Dawson's inheritance is protected in full. Her premarital assets are protected in full, and her business holdings remain hers alone. Mr. Dawson, you are entitled to exactly nothing." The word nothing rang through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Reporters scribbled furiously, some even smirking as they captured the moment. A wave of whispers rushed through the gallery, the kind of sound people make when they witness justice being served right before their eyes. Bradley sat frozen, his mouth open, his face pale. "Nothing?" he whispered, as if the word itself was too heavy to carry. "Nothing," Judge Harris repeated firmly. Then she reached for another folder Patricia had prepared. "Furthermore, according to Section 7 of this agreement, debts incurred by either party individually remain the responsibility of that party. Mrs. Dawson has provided documentation of debts incurred solely by you, Mr. Dawson, credit cards, loans, failed investments, and membership fees totaling approximately $85,000. Those debts remain yours." Bradley's lawyer buried his face in his hands. The spectators erupted in murmurs, and one man in the back couldn't suppress a laugh. Judge Harris lifted her gavel slightly, but not before delivering one final lesson. "Mr. Dawson, 5 years of marriage does count for something. It counts as a very expensive lesson in reading legal documents before you sign them. Court is adjourned." The gavel cracked against the wood, and the sound echoed like final judgment. I sat still for a moment, letting the words sink in. Bradley had entered this courtroom expecting millions. He left with nothing but debt and humiliation. The reporters rushed toward Patricia and me, their voices overlapping with questions, but she held up her hand calmly. "No comment," she said, shielding me with the same steady presence she had carried all along. Bradley, meanwhile, looked like a man stripped bare, his lawyer packed up in silence, desperate to escape the wreckage. The spectators began filing out, buzzing about the spectacle they had just witnessed. As I stood to leave, Bradley's voice cracked through the air one more time. "Rachel, this isn't over," he called, his words desperate, almost pleading. I turned back to him, my voice low but clear. It was over the day you chose greed over love. The prenup didn't ruin you, Bradley. You ruined yourself. He sank back into his chair, his head in his hands, and for the first time, I felt the weight of his hold on me slip away. Justice had not only protected my grandmother's legacy, it had freed me from the prison of his lies. In the weeks after the ruling, Bradley's downfall spread through our community like wildfire. The man who once strutted through country clubs with his hand on my back, pretending to be the architect of our life, became a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails. The headline in the local paper was merciless. Husband loses fortune in courtroom meltdown. His debts swallowed him whole. The luxury car was repossessed within a month. The country club suspended his membership when he failed to pay dues, and soon after, his so-called friends stopped taking his calls. The man who had bragged about being an investor couldn't even secure a loan for an apartment. He ended up moving back in with his parents at 47, sulking in the very house he once mocked for being too modest. But perhaps the cruelest twist for him was the silence from women he once charmed. Word spread fast about his schemes, and soon every circle knew the truth. Bradley had married for money and lost it all. Dates cancelled, invitations dried up. His golden smile no longer opened doors. It only reminded people of the headlines. As for me, I carried on, but not unchanged. For months I had lived in a state of constant tension, waiting for the next blow, the next betrayal. Now I woke up to quiet mornings in my grandmother's house, sunlight spilling across the same oak table where she once gave me her warnings. The silence felt different now, not lonely, free. One afternoon, as I sat with Patricia reviewing paperwork for the last time, she leaned back and said, "Rachel, you could walk away from all this and never look back. Or you could use what you've been through to help someone else." Her words planted a seed. Within a year, I used a portion of my inheritance to create the Dawson Foundation, dedicated to helping women secure prenuptial agreements, access legal support, and protect themselves from financial predators. At our first fundraising event, I stood in front of a room filled with women, some of them holding folders of their own legal battles, and shared my story. My voice shook at first, but then steadied as I saw the nods, the recognition in their eyes. "I thought love meant trust," I told them. "And it does. But trust doesn't mean blind faith. It means protecting yourself so love can thrive without fear." My grandmother taught me that wealth is more than money, it's legacy, dignity, and the right to choose who deserves your loyalty. Don't let anyone take that from you. The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was powerful. The kind that told me my grandmother's wisdom was living on through me, reaching women who needed it most. Sometimes I still see Bradley's name in passing. A foreclosure notice here, a rumor there about him working entry-level sales in another city. His story always ends the same way, a man undone not by his wife, but by his own greed. And me? I no longer define myself by the man I married or the betrayal I survived. I define myself by the strength it took to fight back, by the foundation that now carries my grandmother's spirit forward, and by the peace I feel knowing I didn't just survive him, I rebuilt myself stronger than before. Justice, I realized, isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about rebirth, and in my case, both came hand in hand.